Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk About It. This is your host, Taylor, and I am so thrilled because today's episode, I'm realizing, is a first. I, for whatever reason, have never had an Indigenous person on the podcast. So I am so freaking pumped to finally have Shayla Stonechild on the show today and cannot wait for y'all to listen to her interview and share her story and share her knowledge. She is definitely someone to follow on Instagram, so be sure to click in our episode notes to check her out and follow her. First of all, before we get into anything, I always want to make sure that when we are stepping into these conversations that we're doing it mindfully. So I hope that when you come in, you are listening with an open mind, open ears, and an open heart. You might hear things that you disagree with. You might hear things that feel wrong to you. You might feel wronged. You might feel uncomfortable. And that's the whole purpose. It's the whole purpose of having conversations. It's the whole purpose in learning. It's the whole point in talking to and getting to know people who have different lived experiences than you do. And I really encourage y'all to accept people's stories with truth and acceptance that this is their lived reality, right? And I'm going to share some things in my own thoughts and feelings in this episode as well. Areas where I may be wrong, certainly areas where I still have to learn, as we all are continuously learning. But at the core of all of this, I really hope that y'all just care. I hope that you care. So, I don't need to talk anymore. Let's get into this interview with Shayla. Shayla Stonechild. She has been a catalyst and activist within the Indigenous community, especially in Canada, helping Indigenous youth and women unlocking their full potential and really with a focus on reclaiming their voices. She's doing fantastic things on social media. She also has a podcast that I highly encourage y'all to check out. Again, it was going to be linked, called Matriarch Movement. She does a lot of work within the wellness community as well, and I think just does fantastic shit, okay? She partners with different brands on social media, actually getting some representation of Indigenous folks within these major media companies like Sage, Sephora, The Body Shop, that are really like historic collaborations and partnerships, which is amazing. And also it's like so sad that is like just now and that is like historic. But so happy for her, cheering her on constantly. Hope y'all follow her, check out the links, and I'm going to stop talking so that we can get into it. So let's talk about it. All right. So welcome, Shayla, to the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Thank you so much, Taylor. Hi, for having me. Happy and excited to be here.
Yeah. And I mean, I've been following you for a while on Instagram now. So I'm excited to actually finally get to chat and speak with you. Wondering if you could introduce yourself a little bit for the audience listening. You know, they might follow you on Instagram. They might be aware of your work. But wondering if you could share a little bit about what it is that you do and kind of maybe how people would know you.
Yeah, so Tanse, hello. My name is Shayla Stonechild. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm Métis and Nehiyah from Musqueam First Nations Treaty 4 territory in Saskatchewan, Canada. However, I've been living on the unceded Coast Salish territory, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, also known as Vancouver, for the last 10 years. A little bit about myself. I'm the founder of the Matriarch Movement, nonprofit organization, online platform, and podcast that focuses on amplifying Indigenous voices, specifically women, and providing wellness workshops to BIPOC women and Indigenous youth across Canada. So we do this, started in person, but now it's kind of shifted to virtual landscape right now. I am a yoga instructor, and I also was a host for APTN's Red Earth Uncovered for 3 seasons. And then outside of that, I'm now an Indigenous quote unquote influencer, even though I definitely did not like that concept at one time. So, but yes. I wear a lot of hats.
Definitely. Yeah. You do a lot of different things. And I want to kind of make sure we get to touch on a little bit of all of them today. Could you speak a little bit to the focus that you have on women within the work that you do?
Yeah, so I think historically and currently, Indigenous women and Indigenous people, we're constantly fighting our erasure. And we are always seen as missing and murdered or drunk or dead or dancing. And we're always given, these very stereotypical types of roles within society. And our stories have always been told from a colonial perspective, from a colonial lens. And so really, Matriarch Movement came to me in a dream, and I wanted our stories to be shared the way that we want to share them. And there's so many Indigenous women that are now, rising up and reclaiming their voice and their truth and their power in so many different roles throughout society. And so really my focus is shifting the narrative, the mainstream narrative around Indigenous women. And also to know that it's not just my work, it's like the work of my community and a lot of Indigenous women out there. So that's like my primary focus, but I also realize it's the balance of the masculine and the feminine. And so I think for a long time, we've been running on this toxic patriarchy cycle for the last 150 or however long years.
Yeah, centuries.
So it's now time to, exactly.
Yeah, definitely kind of going against the patriarchal kind of systems and conditioning when you do allow focus for women to just kind of authentically sit in their stories and tell their own stories.
Exactly. Taking our power back. And I think even the concept of power is a really interesting, there's a lot of intersections and nuances that exist with even just the word power. But I feel like Indigenous women, we do need to reclaim our power. And so I think, the words we use too are powerful in itself.
Yeah. I mean, the word power, I have a friend who really challenges me on everything that I fucking say. And sometimes it's incredibly annoying. And other times I'm like, wait, actually, I don't know. But where anytime I bring up power, he's like, well, what even is power? What do you even mean? Does that person really have power? What even is that? And sometimes I'm like,
exactly.
I don't know.
Yes. I think for some of us, it's like access to, resources that we have been deprived of, even access to our basic human needs. And I just speaking from my experience, I also realized even though I am an Indigenous Nahiya Métis woman, I do operate from a sense of privilege because I do live in a city and I do have access to resources and an economy. And a lot of Indigenous people don't even have access to that kind of power or that kind of resources. So I think it's different for everyone. But it's an interesting play on words.
Yeah. And it really is different for everyone. And that's where I think sometimes it gets a little bit messy because there tends to be this comparison. Oftentimes, I think within different marginalized communities of, starting that kind of oppression Olympics that really doesn't do anything for anybody. And I'm wondering kind of how you see, how you have seen that show up in the work that you do.
I try not to take it personally because I realize we're all on, different spectrums of our healing and growth journey and learning about even these definitions of oppression Olympics and these these social justice terms. And so I try to have more like an objective view, but I have experienced, lateral violence online from other Indigenous women and from Indigenous people. And I think sometimes you get caught in, your trauma and it's hard not to, compare it to someone else, or it's hard not to want to pin someone else down and be like, well, this is what I went through, especially on online. Like when when you're an influencer, people see a very preconceived, just nice highlight reel. And it's like, you don't actually know me and my story. So who are you to even judge and compare right now? But I think for me, it's just coming back to an objective lens and not get caught into the drama and the control drama and the mind games and the oppression Olympics out there.
Yeah. That you don't take the bait. I struggle with that. Sometimes I take the fucking bait and then I'm like, oh, damn it, I took the bait.
Right. I mean, and then you're like, then they have you. And I think when coming back to this concept of power too, then it's like, oh, that person is now, you know, taking away kind of my power right now through this mind game. So yeah, I've been learning a lot about boundaries this last year.
Oh yeah. Boundaries are huge. All right. We're going to take a short break right here. And I don't know if I am allowed to do this. But I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it at the risk of like getting very horny on air. So I've shared in the past about Dipsea, okay, like the audio app. They're full of short, sexy stories, all designed to turn you on. And this is literally how I go to sleep every night, okay? I get on the couch because that's still where I'm at, and I open up my app. Okay, sometimes I'll grab my toy, but sometimes I don't. And I want to share with y'all one of my favorites, okay? So, like, you can star your favorite stories, and I kind of just go back to some of the ones I love. Granted, like, they have a lot of different stories, okay? And there's so many to pick from, but I kind of, like, you know, once I find what I like it. And I like Dave, okay? So I don't know if I'm allowed to do this, but let's listen to Dave for a second.
Hey, you're awake. I couldn't sleep either. I just had this dream about us that felt so real.
Tell me about it.
The way you spoke to me, the scent of your hair. It's hard to believe it only happened in my head.
Let's make it happen, Dave.
We were at my place, coming back from dinner. You get a call, and I can see your expression change a little when you look down at your phone. But you answer it anyway. This guy's voice is on the other end, but I can't really make out what he's saying. And it just gets to me. It's like hearing this other guy on the phone bring something out, another side of myself. And just like that, things shift. The air gets heavier around us. My jaw muscles tighten. I know he doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, you're here with me. And I know I don't have any claim over you, but I can't seem to let that phone call go.
It just keeps going. I don't know. I like a little bit of that jealousy. We turn into some fun, sexy play. Okay. That's what I go to sleep to every night. Okay. And then it gets very, very hot and heavy. Okay. And I won't share that part on here. I don't even know if I was allowed to do that, but I hope y'all enjoyed it. I might need to have a little pleasure time midday as I'm sharing this with you all. But if you want to check it out, if you don't want to check it out based off of that, I don't know what's going on. But they have different voices. You know, you can pick from male voices, female voices, non-binary voices. You can, there's just such a plethora of options, okay? And like I said, they release new content every week. So there's always things to explore. And there's also ones where, like, I'm trying to go to sleep and it's not, like, actually sexual. It's not hot and heavy. And they're just, like, talking to you, like, before you go to sleep. And it's, like, really nice because when you're going to sleep by yourself sometimes, it's, like, really nice to just kind of fantasize and, like, imagine, you know, that there's someone else there that's kind of, like, tucking you in and, like, they're going to go finish up some work and, you know, like, it's very, very comforting, okay? And so I absolutely love Dipsea. I really hope y'all check it out because they are offering an extended 30-day free trial. Think of how many stories you could listen to in 30 days when you go to dipseastories.com/Taylor. Again, that's 30 days of full access for free, okay? Go to DIPSEA stories.com/Taylor. Again, that's dipseastories.com/Taylor. Go get your pleasure on. Go get your relaxation on, okay? Get into that imagination, get into that fantasy world. I'm like, I could keep going on and on and on about this because I love this freaking app and I love these stories and it has just been so helpful for me. Like, dating's hard right now, okay? It's been so helpful for me. So I really hope y'all check it out. One last time, that's dipseastories.com/Taylor for an extended 30-day free trial. And let's get back into the show. And I mean, just kind of speaking to trauma and kind of, you know, reacting out of trauma, living in your trauma, you do like yoga from like a trauma-informed lens. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think, first of all, the yoga industry in itself is just incredibly whitewashed and appropriated to begin with. But I don't think I've ever seen somebody kind of speak or engage in yoga from a trauma-informed perspective.
Yeah, I think just knowing that like each person, each student is walking probably with their own trauma at the end of the day. And really, my goal is not to create a hierarchy within a class. And I feel like there's a lot of hierarchy within the yoga wellness world, whether that's advanced postures, whether it's like how we show up to the practice. I have never, when I first got introduced to wellness, I didn't feel, you know, comfortable or safe in my own body. I was the only Indigenous person, brown person, even within a room. And so when I went to those trainings, they some of them weren't trauma informed and others were. And really trauma informed is allowing that person, that student, giving them options to feel like they're in full power and their full energetic sovereignty. And you're just simply a guide for them to awaken to their own truth. And I think, you know, trauma takes many forms, especially for Indigenous people. It's multi-generational, it's intergenerational, and it's physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, psychic abuse, physical, sexual abuse. And so it's really being articulate and mindful of the language that you are using in class, even the atmosphere, the container that you create, and providing as many options for that student to feel as safe as possible. And that's going to look different for each and every person.
Yeah. I mean, really just kind of taking people where they're at, which I'm a huge fan of and definitely practice in my work and in my personal life, you know, obviously not 100% perfect in that, but it's really important.
Me neither. Me neither. Yeah. And I'm still a learner. Like there's so much stuff that I still have to learn throughout the wellness industry.
Yeah. Well, and you touched on words being used as well and being really intentional about the words that we use and how much kind of weight and power those can carry. And I want to kind of talk a little bit about words within the Indigenous community, or not maybe within, but, you know, in reference to. I think a lot of people likely engage with your page and your work to become a bit more educated on Indigenous issues, to, see kind of the life experience and be able to understand more what people deal with within the Indigenous community. And I'm wondering kind of if you can share first, just kind of like what your experience has been with that, like in terms of people wanting things from you or wanting education from you, people wanting to know your experience. What is that like for you?
Yeah. So my experience, you know, speaking about Canadian history and, you know, quote unquote, Indigenous rights and Indigenous politics, knowing that we're all treaty people at the end of the day. So it's not just an Indigenous issue. It's like a human rights issue. And so for me, a lot of my truth comes from sharing my personal story. My father went to residential school. He was in the residential school system and a system that was designed to kill his spirit. It eventually did. He became institutionalized within the federal prison system out here in Canada, which is largely made up of Indigenous people and Indigenous men. And he had his own cycles of addiction because of the harm that was endured at the hands of the Canadian federal institution and the RCMP and the Catholic Church. And so when I speak about this, it's hard not to bring up my own story and almost my own trauma or also my own strengths. And so for me, I realized really a shift in my own consciousness at 16 because my father ended up taking his life in prison. And so really for me, that was a really big shift in my own life because I'm like, how could someone want to take their life? Like, aren't we supposed to be meant to live and to be in our gifts and our truth? And my father never really had that ability because of the harm. And so for me, that's kind of when I wanted to start focusing on my own community and focusing on Indigenous youth and realizing like, even though we are served a really shitty hand, we can transmute and alchemize our pain and we can make like a better future. And so for me, I also realized that a lot of Indigenous worldviews and teachings, there's this sense of coming back to relationship, coming back to kinship.
Yeah.
And I think for me, that's also working with non-Indigenous people. And so there was a lot of pressure, I think, initially when I started using my voice, because I didn't realize how strong my voice and powerful my voice was until I started using it.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden these opportunities start coming. And I think, you know, as I'm sure you may relate to when you are from a marginalized community, you feel that sometimes I should say yes to everything because others don't have access to this. So I'm going to say yes to everything. And so that's what I did. Yeah, the scarcity mindset. So I'm still learning to say no to things. And I think sometimes it can get overwhelming because you may be the source of information or education for a certain amount of people, and realizing that that's sometimes free emotional labor. And I'm also dealing with personal stuff behind the scenes.
Yep.
So there's a lot, but I think it comes back to like, now I have a lot of tools that align me back and ground me into my nervous system and into the now. But I constantly have to remind myself why. Yeah. Like, why am I having these conversations? What is the purpose? And I think it comes back to relationship, and it comes back to healing, and it comes back to healing intergenerationally. And when we talk about intergenerational trauma, non-Indigenous people have intergenerational stuff that they also have to heal. So for me, it's like, I now love the concept of Indigenous futurism, and I love the concept of radically imagining a new future that has yet to be built in relation to non-Indigenous people as well. Yeah. So yeah, it's been a learning, it's been a learning process.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing all of that and for your vulnerability there. You know, I can't help but kind of, and I think I've felt this way for a while now, but just that there are a lot of similarities between what the Indigenous community has had to experience under white supremacy and what Black people have had to experience under white supremacy. I'm wondering how that comes up for you and kind of what your perspective is on the similarities there.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of intersections. And then I also realize there's a lot of nuances and you know, what the shift with, like when the Black Lives Matter movement and the death of George Floyd happened, you know, it was hard not to feel everything as well. Yeah. And then I also had to take a step back and realize this is not my place to be speaking right now. This is my place for deep listening and learning, because I still have so much to learn from the Black community as well. And so I think, you know, realizing that I too need to figure out how to support, you know, people outside of just the Indigenous community. And so I'm still on that learning process right now, but there are a lot of similarities and the harms that both of us have gone through due to colonization and white supremacy. And there are still like this, we don't even know what exists in the world, because we both have a history of being so oppressed that we don't even know what we're capable of, because we've never seen it happen within our bloodline, you know? And so that's something that I think of often too.
Yeah.
Like, and it comes back to futurism too, like Indigenous futurism, Black futurism, Afro-Indigenous futurism. How can we begin to imagine something that never has happened before?
And see, I think that some white people would hear this and think, well, you know, we have Indigenous people in Congress, you know, we had Obama, you know, and so they do see these kind of in some ways small, or I guess I'll say rare, pieces of representation where it seems like there is an opportunity for a future that looks different than what the bloodline has known. And therefore, bloop, see, it's fine. There's no issue because, see, look, you do have power.
Yeah. Right.
You're in a position of power. So actually, you're good.
Yeah, even though those are like very performative like acts in itself, because at the end of the day, I feel like a lot of it is a performative, and it's also a way of like silencing us. They're like, oh, well, you should be happy because you have this day or you have this position now. And that's, I'm just going to give you a little piece so that I feel like some of it's a distraction too, to really the work itself. Yeah. So yeah, and at the same time, it is, for me, it is cool to witness, Indigenous people, you know, taking up space. However, activism comes in many forms. So the way I do it is going to be a lot different. And maybe I don't agree with how you're doing it, but I can still respect that you're taking up this space in a colonial place that I could never do. And so I think there's also like, it's like you got the pros and the cons for both.
Yeah, definitely. And there is so much nuance in it, and none of it, you know, talking about any of these communities, none of them are a monolith. You know, there's going to be differences and disagreements within all of it. But I'm so glad that you brought up the distraction, like performative piece of it, because it was recently, you know, Indigenous Peoples Day, and there was celebration for that. And I have to kind of check myself of like, okay, yes, I am not Indigenous. And I have feelings about this, and I want to speak on it, and I want to help support the community however I can, also knowing that the way that I think I'm supporting might not be what is actually needed and might potentially actually just cause more harm or frustration. And I tried to hold space for both of like having Indigenous People Day, great on one hand, you know, recognition, okay, awareness, yes. But also there's a lot of other things that would have significant impact aside from that. And feeling like, not what am I supposed to celebrate here, but what does it really do? And maybe that's like apathetic and pessimistic of me, but I was like, oh, I hope, you know, I don't want to like offend and be like, oh, it doesn't matter to have Indigenous Peoples Day. Like it matters, you know, but also in the same hand, what else are we doing?
Exactly. And it's like, what is the long-term goal here? What is and what does our day-to-day actions look like? Not just, you know, solidify it one day a year and then just go on your way. And every day is Indigenous Peoples Day if you're living on stolen land. So like we got a lot of work to do.
Yes. And that's the point that so many people don't grasp, because it's Canada, it's America.
But it's been built on our erasure. Like, and that's what I don't understand either. Like celebrating Canada Day, I'm like, Canada is what, 153 years in the colonial timeline. Indigenous people have been here for thousands, tens of thousands of years. Christianity, the Catholic Church, Canada, they're kind of babies in comparison to like Indigenous people. And so, I don't know. And at the same time, like growing up, it would have been nice to, you know, I imagine myself as a younger kid to have a day that recognized, you know, my community and to see like orange, even though orange shirts is like, can be a performative act in itself too. Also seeing like other people recognize your own story. I feel like you get validated through that. And so I think there's also, recognizing we have a lot more work to do, and this is just like the minuscule amount. But it's also cool to see a shift within even our nations in itself and our own Indigenous communities. And there's so many Indigenous people and nations that are reclaiming their own right to self-governance, their own autonomy. And that's really inspiring to see.
Yeah. Well, so I want to kind of ask you a little bit about your education. And I bring this up because with one of my white friends a long time ago on the podcast, we kind of unpacked the backpack of privilege. And there's a lot of things I could say about that episode. But the point that like really got to him was having to imagine himself be a Black boy in school when being taught about slavery, and of realizing, how I might have felt learning about that, about myself, that was kind of like a light bulb for him. And I think back to middle school learning about slavery and being like, what would that have meant for me then? Like, fuck, you know? And for the most part, I was in South Carolina, so there was some celebration. But for the most part, nobody was like celebrating slavery in my face. Right. Some, but majority not. And so I'm wondering if you can kind of take us back to what your experience was learning about, and I know it's maybe a little bit different in Canada, so I might have some ignorance here, but, you know, like Thanksgiving, for example, like learning about how the country's founded, like Canada Day, perhaps, and being taught about that. And then not only is it like, yeah, actually your people were murdered, put into schools, all this terrible shit has happened, and we love our country so much. Like,
I think for me throughout school and education and, you know, my experience here in Canada, there was a lot of cognitive dissonance, and I grew up in a predominantly white community and city in Alberta. And unfortunately, you know, I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what it meant to be Indigenous. You would have asked me that even at the age of like 18 or whatever. I was still figuring it out because I wasn't given those tools, especially in school. And so I actually didn't even really learn anything about Indigenous people in school, to be honest. I think we learned more about Indigenous people elsewhere outside of Canada than we did in the school curriculum. And Alberta is really, really racist. Super. So I'm also not very surprised. And you know, I am Métis and I'm Nehiao. And so my dad is full Cree, but my mom's Métis. And so there's an aspect within me that is French. And so my extended family on my Olette side, they're actually Catholic. And so I actually grew up around religion.
Yeah.
And so I've spent a lot of time dismantling and unlearning really these colonial religious paradigms that even I was institutionalized in when I was younger. And so I think my education didn't really start till I was like 20. And then I actually had a boyfriend. He was like, what does it mean to be Indigenous? And I was just like, wow. So I've been on an unlearning and relearning journey for the last decade, I would say. And unfortunately, I don't think the curriculum out in Alberta is getting much better. I think they're not even wanting to teach about residential schools at all. And they're not wanting the truth to come out because Canada would have to take the federal institution itself would have to take massive accountability for the harm that it has done. And it continues to here in Canada, realizing that genocide isn't just a thing that happened within these boarding residential schools. It's seen through missing murdered Indigenous women and girls in the Two-Spirit crisis. It's seen through the lack of clean drinking water. We have the highest amount of suicides within Indigenous communities, and most of them are made up of youth. So also realizing that like this is ongoing still, genocide.
Yeah. And I really hate when I see people kind of really uphold these stereotypes and kind of really like negative tropes around Indigenous people without recognizing that like those are trauma responses and kind of blaming them for, you know, engaging and suffering from addiction or, you know, the suicide rates, all of that you just kind of touched on, that people like to kind of put that blame on that on that population of people that are engaging with that, very similar to with the Black community. Well, what about Black on Black crime? Well, what about that?
Yeah, exactly. Right. And it's almost, it takes away from the harm that's actually happening. And I think another thing to reference is like the racist Indian Act that still influences every aspect of Indigenous people's lives here in Canada. And, you know, if you read 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph, it gives you a blueprint into understanding how even alcohol, how it was introduced into our communities. And so this was actually because of colonization and because of white people. So like to know that these stereotypes have stemmed from colonization and from white supremacy.
Absolutely. Yeah. How do you think you see people engaging with like meaningful care, support, activism for Indigenous people who are non-Indigenous?
Like, what do I think of it, or what am I?
Like how do you see like non-Indigenous people actually engaging in impactful, supportive things?
Yeah. I think initially something that when I started finding my voice, I actually took over Jillian Harris's blog, and it was on Canada Day, and she originally wanted me to like write a traditional like Indigenous food recipe, and I was like, oh gosh, I definitely am not going to do that, but I'll take it over for Canada Day and talk about my reality and my truth.
Yeah.
And so I think that was the first initial like kind of ally that I saw that actually genuinely cared about my story and was willing to like give me, I guess, pass the mic or like give me the platform to say that. And so I think that was my initial first actual like sense of allyship that I felt from a non-Indigenous person. And then I made it really vocal that I'm into long-term relationships.
Yeah.
I'm into long-term partnerships. And so I think that's where true allyship comes in, is being in direct relation with Indigenous people. And for me, a lot of the allies I work with are for long term. It's not just a one-off type of thing. And it requires a deep listening and understanding, and almost of like just letting your own stuff just take the back seat for a minute, and you know, offering support to the one that needs it. And so I have a lot of really great allies and non-Indigenous people in my life. But I think allyship shows up in many different ways. And to support Indigenous communities, I think right now we're still asking for our basic human needs being met, and we're still asking for clean drinking water, and we're still, you know, asking for just our basic human needs. And so I think true allyship is like, how can we begin to find solutions to these problems that we continuously talk about? We have the framework. We have the 94 calls to action by the Truth and Reconciliation Report. We have the 231 calls to justice for missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls in Two-Spirit crisis here in Canada. So we have the framework for true allyship to happen. We just need action and pressure to keep it flowing and to keep it coming, so that we're not just talking on one day of the year.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where it's like, people might ask, well, what can I do? And it's like, well, if you look, it's there.
It's there. It's actually there. It's like Indigenous nations came together with non-Indigenous people, had these conversations, and then made a framework. It's there.
Yes. Well, and I love your point, kind of touching on long-term allyship. And I think for me, you know, with my own kind of identities and, you know, allyship, it has always really centered on like, you just have to genuinely care. And when you genuinely care, it becomes just a part of your life. It becomes something that you long-term give a shit about, to be involved in and to learn about. And yeah, I love that you've been able to partner with Jillian. I think she is one of the few people that I've seen like really actually stay committed to the shit and be able to be called on her shit and be able to engage in a really like meaningful way. That I'm like, yeah, thank you.
Right. And I'm still friends. Like I still talk to Jillian, like we're still good. And so at the end of the day, it comes down to, like true respect. And there's like 3 pillars within Indigenous communities, not just 3, but like 1, respect; 2, creating a reciprocal relationship; and 3, creating a relationship-based approach to the land, the water, the earth, the sky, but also each other and ourselves. And so really that is what we're looking for at the end of the day. It's just to be in kinship and relation with one another.
Which is like so fucking core to just being human, that has gotten so lost and shat on by colonization that it like it breaks my heart, because I'm like the things that I do learn about like Indigenous culture, I'm just like, oh, but that's so beautiful. That's what it should be. Why hasn't it been this whole time?
Yeah, exactly. Right. I think, at the end of the day too, I think we're all dealing with our own like biases and our own, harmful stuff, our own shadow side at the end of the day too. So it's also to be like really gentle and honest even with yourself. But yeah, the values of Indigenous people, I'm like, these are the values of humanity. It should be.
Yeah. And it's like through colonization, there's like the values of like these countries in which we separate ourselves in, and like they're not equitable. They're not fair. They're not actually based on humanness.
No, they're not based on spirit. It's like based on short-term satisfaction, greed, complete division, polarity. And that's something too, is like when they tore away our relationship to the land, that they're tearing our relationship to life, essentially. And this fragmentation to the land was also reflected in the fragmentation within our own mind. And so there's actual words in Indigenous languages that directly create the relationship between plant and human, or there's words to describe the kinship. There's no words in the English language to really describe that. It's all fragmentated. And so when we tore away our connection to the land, we're tearing away our connection to our soul's purpose and to our essence. And so I think really coming back to reclaiming those relationships is fundamental for our growth and our ascension as a species, as a human, as humans.
Yeah. It's so heartbreaking. Like it hurts my heart so much. I'm still in the process of reading Braiding Sweetgrass, but in it where she does talk about language, and she talks about how kind of what you just spoke on, the fragments of language that happen, but where she was kind of speaking on how like even to call something like a river, it's not just like the river, it's to be a river. And that these things in English language are spoken in a framework of being, of living in her language. And where I was just like, yeah, that brings such a different respect, such a different respect and connection to these things that are actually literally living and that fucking bring us life. And here we are, like, it's a thing.
Right. And it's one of our sustainable goals. And it's like, it's not just a catchphrase that we're seeing across like the capitalistic consumer world now, where everyone wants to be sustainable. And it's like, well, what does that actually look like within your own life?
Yeah. What are your feelings on like the environmentalism movement? And
it feels like kind of another like marketing thing.
It's like another like, yoga wellness thing.
Yeah. So you just really have to really get curious of like, this brand is saying one thing, but what are their core values? What are they actually doing? Like, what are what practices do they have in place? And a lot of the time, Indigenous people are missing from these global conversations around sustainability, around, our sovereignty. And so I don't know, for me, it's hard to listen when it's like Indigenous people hold the natural laws of the universe and everything. We have direct connection to being sustainable. So why are these voices missing from these conversations?
Intentionally.
Yeah, intentionally. Yeah, exactly. Goes back to like what's been happening.
Yeah, because listening and acknowledging that is also acknowledging everything that's happened.
And everything that's still happening too. So I think sometimes, we see, I think like we don't see reconciliation because they're not done with exploiting our resources yet. They're still taking. And so I think that's also something to be aware of.
Yeah. I'm wondering, in Seattle, we have like real rent, and someone, I think it was Rob and I were talking about it. And then I think I saw somebody else who I follow who's Indigenous kind of here in my area, kind of talk about like the hypocrisy almost in real rent. And I'm not sure if that's something that's like practiced in Canada, but wondering if you can kind of share your thoughts on paying real rent.
I'm going through this process right now. I'm paying like so much in Vancouver, and I'm like, wow, this feels like I shouldn't have to be paying this rent. Like I'm forking out quite a bit of money. What defines real rent? Like,
so from my understanding here, and because I have paid it before, is because we are on stolen land, we are paying the Indigenous communities that are still here. And so Duwamish community here is who I kind of connect with and follow and pay. And so it goes to helping support their community. And so it's because we're on their land, you know, we're essentially paying them rent. But then there's people who are like, well, by doing that, then you're perpetuating this idea that like, you know, we have to be paying to be on land, and how that kind of goes against the like ideals or culture within the Indigenous population in the first place. But then it's like, well, this is the situation that you're in. Like, because it is stolen.
Yeah. Well, exactly. I haven't heard of that definition before, so thank you for letting me know what real rent means. We have mutual aid out here, and so like donating to like land defenders, donating to the people that are on the front lines. I think that's also a way, and letting them decide what to do with that money. And because in Canada we do have like our own, there's different. Each nation has their own kind of different. You know, values and what they want. If that's even an option, I would hope so out here. But there's a lot of mutual aid things to donate to here in Canada.
Interesting. Yeah. A lot of differences, but also a lot of similarities between the States and Canada.
Well, and I think like, I don't know, like I still have a lot to learn in regards to like what the States and its relation to Indigenous people and the populations out there. But I do think Canada, we do have certain frameworks within the federal institution within the government that I know they have to abide by. And I don't know if that's not even that doesn't exist at all in the States, I'm pretty sure.
I don't think so. And I think that maybe that's part of why the real rent thing exists here, because it's like speaking directly to the people. Like people will have the signs out in their front yard of like, pay your real rent. Wow. Like, it's
okay. Well, maybe I'm gonna pop under the signs. Getting some ideas out here.
Well, and our city is named after Chief Seattle as well, and the community was actually saying like, if we don't honor, you know, what he actually wanted for the city, to not use the name anymore and stuff. So I need to look into it a lot more. But there's a lot. There's a lot.
There's a lot. There's a lot.
Yeah. Well, and so I know we spoke a little bit about kind of yoga and like your practice within like movement. How do you cope with all of this shit? I'm very professional.
I know. I'm like, it's been a really big learning curve. I did train before I started taking up space online or using my voice. I was in trainings for about 2 years, and I was really spending time healing myself and working on my wounds. And so when I came into this social media world, I kind of was coming with like feeling strong, feeling capable, and with a toolkit. And so my day-to-day, it looks different each day depending where I am. But I think for me, I'm clairsentient too, and I'm a highly sensitive person. So I actually have this thing where I feel everything. Like I feel the energy when I walk into a room. I get really, exhausted if I exert too much. So I do need a lot of time to myself. So when I'm not vocal online, I'm spending a lot of time nourishing my world through meditation, through yoga, through, going out, working out, getting that blood flowing, but also through plant medicine, through flower essence, through psilocybin. So there's different things in my toolkit and also my network, my support system, coming back to kinship and my community and my family. I have a really great, really great brothers and a really great mom who supports everything that I do. So if I do quote unquote one day get canceled, or if I go through that whole process,
I hope you never do.
I know. I don't want to put it out there.
Stay big, stay powerful, stay in your voice. It's not fun.
But I would have a system that would support me no matter what. So that feels really good.
Yeah. Has psychotherapy ever been something that you've engaged with, or your feelings towards that?
I would have to do research and more like, I don't even, psychotherapy is something that I'm, completely new to.
Yeah. Well, because I think so much of just the therapy space alone is very like colonized and very drenched in white wellness.
Well, that's another thing is like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I believe it's called, was actually like appropriated and stolen from the Blackfoot Nation. So,
how convenient
I think that's
they left that out
away from Western. Yeah. So no, he spent like 2 weeks in Sundance in ceremony with the Blackfoot people. There's a talk on YouTube actually that talks about but so I've kind of stayed away from Western psychology. That's
what I was thinking, and I don't blame you. And I didn't know that, and I need to go watch that video. Watch it. And that's happened to not only Indigenous people, Black people. Like it's our tools and our medicine and our worldviews being regurgitated and then sold as a new age concept. Yep.
Yeah.
So fucked up. So frustrating.
Super.
I hate it.
And for me, my therapy comes from ceremonies, from Sundance and from our practices. We had like purification ceremonies, sacrifices, piercings. There's different things that happen. And so for me, I would go to those rather than go to, I think, initially therapy.
Yeah. That makes total sense. And I mean, I could see where that's like so healing, because you are within community, in relationship. And like one of the huge parts that, people benefit from in therapy is being able to have that kind of relationship where you have the space to like just exist in a judgment-free space. And so much of why we even need that in the first place is because of the like social norms and structures in which white supremacy has built for our society to even exist in the first place, where, when you are able to kind of go to these ceremonies and whatnot, like that's just your community. That's the values and the beliefs, and you're not all separated and like this individualism.
No. Yeah, exactly. I went to a pipe ceremony. One thing that kept happening this summer was I kept having this like voice, or like my inner voice being like, you got to return to your traditional territory. You got to go back to ceremony. And so I went to a pipe ceremony, and we're sitting around in a circle, and it was just like, it was a sharing circle, and there's different teachings that come with the pipe ceremony, but that was medicine. And that's, I think, where the therapy for us happens, is within our practices, within our ceremonies that have been here since time immemorial, that unfortunately got taken away from us because of, colonization and the Indian Act and the 1960s potlatch ban. And so we do have the tools that is needed for our healing within our communities already. And I mean, it's not to say that I would never go to therapy, but I mean, I would go to my territory probably first.
Definitely. Yeah. And I mean, how do you view the integration of Indigenous practices with non-Indigenous people, like healing ceremonies, that kind of stuff? Like, do you see there being a place for folks who are non-Indigenous to kind of support, spread? Like, is there a way for that to not be appropriating, or to be still allowing the Indigenous people to hold power in those practices, but to, in a way, I guess not in the way that yoga has spread from India, but without the appropriation piece of it being a healing tool for people in general to kind of come back together. Like, can that be a celebration of Indigenous culture?
Yeah, I think it's very dependent on the nation, because like each nation kind of has their own, each tribe has kind of their own feelings about that.
Yeah.
And I think for me, it comes back to that kinship. If I'm in deep relation or respect with a non-Indigenous person, I would invite them to a ceremony, but I would make sure that it got the approval or the acceptance of the elder or the knowledge keeper, whoever was facilitating that. And so I think for me, I would love to see, you know, I think there's so much medicine in our ceremonies that are needed for everyone. And so I would love to see more, you know, non-Indigenous people within that. But I also realize that that comes with, you know, putting that work out there, doing the work.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. And it does kind of put it at risk in some ways of being appropriated, being profited off of being kind of misconstrued, if you will, to the white man's benefit. And that's scary. And I could totally see where like communities would feel like, nope, don't even want to go near it.
Exactly. And so, I think I would have to really trust someone to like let them into that, to that life, into that circle. But not to say that it's completely closed off, because I think, you know, our teachings are inclusive for everyone. And so I think, you know, an elder would want us to be side by side in relation with one another. And a lot of the times it's the elders that are open, that are welcoming in everyone. And it just reminds me like, oh yes, I do have to open my heart, maybe a little bit more. And so, but it's unfortunate that there has been there's been a taking away of trust, obviously, through everything that's happened. And so it's going to take some time for that to be rebuilt.
Absolutely. It's going to take some reconciliation. It's going to take some like land back. It's going to take some like actual shit, I think. Because it doesn't feel like much has really been done.
Exactly. And I would invite like listeners to read, Jody Wilson-Raybould just came out with a book, Speaking Truth to Power. And so she actually talks about her experience, working within the House of Commons, working with Justin Trudeau, and how, you know, even her being an Indigenous woman within the cabinet, she felt like she could only do so much within that position. So I'd invite listeners to read that book to give you kind of a present day sense of what's actually happening within House of Commons and within these structures. And it does feel like not much.
Okay. Yeah. We'll include that in the episode notes for people to check out. I could keep chatting with you for so much longer. I so appreciate all of your energy and vulnerability and kind of sharing your experience, your story, your knowledge. Can you share a little bit about where people can find you, how they can support you and your work, and just where to find you?
Yeah, you can follow me on Shayla0H, Shayla O on Instagram. You can also follow the Matriarch Movement. There I post everything that's currently happening. And I also invite listeners to write your local MP, MLA, and demand that they start implementing the 94 calls to action within the Truth and Reconciliation Report here in Canada and the 231 calls to justice. So taking your allyship a step further and putting some action into the world is how you can also support me.
Absolutely. Definitely. Well, thank you so much. And I hope we get to have you on again at some point.
Yeah, me too. Awesome. Thank you, Taylor. Have a great day.
Thanks. All right. That does it for today's episode. Thank you so much for making it all the way through and keeping your ears, your hearts, and your minds open. It would mean so much to me if you could take a second or two after listening to this episode to leave a review on iTunes and let me know what you're enjoying about the show. I love reading, you know, what your favorite episodes are, where you guys listen, and definitely feel free to share this with a friend. I mean, part of how we break down the stigmas around these topics is by talking about them, right? And sharing them with more people. So definitely share the podcast. And again, really wanting to include all of you in this podcast. So if you have questions or you want to share a thought or an experience, please send in a voice memo to ask.letstalkaboutit@gmail.com. And I'm really excited to keep having these conversations and breaking down these stigmas. So thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and I'll talk to you next time.